The following episode can be extremely disturbing to some individuals, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. Mankind has never been without conflict. If you can count on one thing when it comes to human beings, it is violence. Even first world countries aren't immune to the effects of violent atrocities. Nothing brings out darkness in mankind more than war. Some of the most disturbing and monstrous acts have been done in wartime. Things that you would think that no one would ever do has been done. I found some incidents where some of the horrors that soldiers and unfortunately civilians had to endure. This without a doubt caused a lot of emotional trauma, and to those involved has changed them forever, losing whatever peace they had once possessed. Propaganda has been one of the most prominent features of the two biggest conflicts in world history. Like in the Second World War, the United States and Japan, both of them used propaganda to stir emotions and invoke hatred. That way that they would feel less likely to show compassion on the battlefield. For example, before the war, US propaganda was so effective against the Japanese that they had the soldiers believing that the Japanese were just savages, and they called the whole campaign Japanese hunting, implying that the Japanese were animals and they were to be hunted. This propaganda, coupled with the intensity of the war, meant soldiers went over the moon after killing Japanese. Some of them took Japanese body parts as trophies. Ears started appearing on belts, while soldiers were wearing necklaces with teeth on them. It didn't stop there. Some soldiers started mailing skulls and other body parts home as trophies. This actually got so bad that in 1942, the US Army had to issue an order to stop this behavior, but at that time, it was already too late. Despite the fact that a lot of propaganda against the Japanese army was conjured in the US, there was no shortage of evil and sinister acts committed by the Japanese. During the Second World War, prisoners of war, some of them were used for something special. Take for example the dinner party that was held for a Japanese Imperial Navy officer. The attendees, they were offered a special steak. This special steak was called kimo, meaning fresh flesh, and it came from the bodies of executed POWs. After the incident, a large number of Japanese army officials started cannibalizing US soldiers' bodies. On some occasions, some body parts were amputated while the soldier was still alive, and later cooked and served to the officials. One pilot that barely escaped this fate was picked up by a submarine, and this pilot became the President of the United States. His name, George Bush. This is my dad's only story, at least the only one he's ever shared with me. It was during the First Gulf War. He was a Royal Marine Commando. Him and his company were under attack by mortar and rocket fire. They had their heads down, and he was laying next to his best friend, and the next moment, everything was on fire. One of the explosives hit nearby, and his best friend, he was hit. The damage was so severe that there was nothing left of him. You saw suffering every day. You know you could do nothing about it. Watching people beg for food, knowing that some would die, and only a couple of days from starvation and poverty. He would see this over and over again. It was such a shock after living in a society with social safety nets, such as soup kitchens, homeless shelters, and etc. It's hard to push that stuff down. You tell yourself, it's not my problem, or I can't do anything about it, and you try to carry on with your mission. Even though it's completely beyond your power, that stuff still eats away at your soul. I'm a Vietnam veteran. Back when I was in Vietnam, I knew this guy named Jedediah. He was a mechanic. He didn't have any combat roles, but we saw him every day. He was a very good handyman. Now, Jedediah wasn't the most intelligent, but he was pretty street smart. He was honestly the kindest man I ever met. He was always helping someone. He told us because he couldn't fight, he would do whatever he could to help us out, to make our jobs easier. He would cook good food for us, he would fix things, and he would retrieve things for us. Everybody loved Jedediah. Unfortunately, one day, our camp got hit by mortar fire. When it was all over, Jedediah's mechanical partner screamed that Jedediah was hit. We all rushed over to him. He had a massive gash in his liver area. We had to pick him up and rush him to the tent, where the medics began to work on him. We had to hold Jedediah's guts, because they started pouring out. He was screaming for his mother. At this point, I knew he was done. His wound was too great, but I kept praying for a miracle. Finally, he grunts, and he begins to scream that he wasn't ready to die. Then he grunts and starts convulsing, blood pouring out of his mouth. After a few seconds, he goes limp. Even though he passed, we all just stood there holding him. After a few moments, the medic lets go, and he has us do the same. As we all looked at the mangled corpse, that was pretty scary. I've been in Vietnam for about a year at that point, so I saw plenty of mangled bodies, but seeing such a pure, innocent, genuine good person like Jedediah dying in agony really hurt. It hurt even more to know that Jedediah was black, and he died for a country that didn't even love him. During the war, Switzerland did its best to remain neutral, but it was sought after by both sides. When Germany came up against it, the United Kingdom sent reinforcements. That's how one British company found itself stationed in a remote village in the Swiss Alps. A few weeks after the British company had entered the village, the locals started to notice a series of strange disappearances. First, it started out with pieces of wood, tarps, and other valuables disappearing. And then it culminated to a child from the village ended up going missing. At first, it was assumed that the disappearance was just a tragic accident. But then more children started to disappear. The only adult to disappear was a private from the British unit. He went missing from the barracks. And this led to the rumor that a monster was living in the mountains and was preying on the village. After his disappearance, more children started to disappear. One night, a figure was seen peering through a window of one of the houses that the soldiers patrolled. They yelled at the figure, which took off. They gave chase, reaching the edge of the village, where the figure just seemed to disappear, as if jumping into the ground. The soldiers searched around and they found a cave. It was hollowed out by the side of a snowdrift. Shots were fired from the cave, and they were returned by the soldiers. After a moment of silence, they investigated the cave further. Inside, they found the private. He was shot through the heart, and surrounded by him were the half-eaten bodies of missing children. This actually had to do with an individual. It was a German female named Irma Gries. She was born on October of 1923. Her sister Helen Gries said that Irma wasn't one for fighting, that she always ran away from it. When she went to work, she chose to work at a hospital. She stayed there for 2 years. She was wanting to become a nurse, but the labor exchange would not allow it. In July of 1942, she tried again, but instead, they sent her to a concentration camp. She did protest against it, but she stayed there until March 1943. Then later, she was sent to another camp, the notorious Auschwitz. She remained there until 1945. By all accounts, if not for the war, she would have been a caregiver and a decent individual. But that's not what she's known for. War tends to bring out the darkest parts in some people. It can even harden the nicest of people. When she was stationed there, she became a totally different person by appearance. On the outside, Irma Gries was a teenage Aryan dream. She was pretty by Nazi standards. She was known during this time to carry a whip, a pistol, and a set of half-starved dogs that would attack on her command. She would shoot people unprovoked and randomly, systematically using her belt to whip prisoners. Then she would kick them when they were down. It is actually recorded that she was aroused by the sadism. She got off on torturing people, cutting prisoners. Then when the cuts got infected and required surgery, she would demand that they would do it without anesthesia. She would regularly watch the procedure in the operating room, enjoying it sexually. She enjoyed it so immensely that she had saliva running down the corners of her mouth. At the end of the war, she was tried, and she was hung for her crimes. She was only 22 years old. War can be a terrible thing. Any kind of violence can be a terrible thing. I know there's a lot of games out there when it comes to war, but as nothing in comparison to the real thing. And regardless of what you think about military service, the members are still human. Some of them will experience horrors that we can never imagine. Most of them go in for a noble purpose, wanting to help others, either from oppressive regimes or to protect the rights of others. Making such sacrifices for one's ideals is honorable, and it definitely deserves our respect. Let's hope that most of us don't have to experience such atrocities. Hopefully one day, love will be the dominant quality of all humans, instead of dehumanizing other races with blind hatred. For in fact, we are all the same when we really get to know each other. Thank you very much for joining me for this edition of The Creeper. Wars can be very terrible. People can break and do things that they normally would never do if not exposed to some of these situations. I wish it would never come to this. I especially feel sorry for the ones who went to Vietnam. They went through all those atrocities just to come back home to people who didn't want them. That's terrible. I'm going to give a special thanks to my patrons. Your support is greatly appreciated. Hopefully, sharing information like this will open people's eyes to the amount of stress and strain that people go through who have to experience these things. Well, you all stay safe, and until next time, this is Dallas, signing off.